Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed a guy who built a publishing platform designed for independent writers who want to strike off on their own. Let's say you're a writer who wants to publish your work to the web and eventually monetize it. These days, you have plenty of options. You might open a Medium account and join the platform's partner program, or maybe you launch a Substack newsletter. If you're really ambitious, you could throw together a WordPress website and integrate it with a payment tool like Stripe. Or you could just launch an account on Ghost, a publishing platform created a few years ago by a guy named John O'Nolan. Before founding Ghost, John was the deputy head of design at WordPress, and though he was always a fan of the open source CMS, he thought he could create something just a little bit better. So John launched a Kickstarter campaign, and after raising tens of thousands of dollars, he developed Ghost. Today, it's used by some of the world's largest brands, and his hope now is that independent writers will use it to monetize their content. I spoke to John about the platform and why he thinks a writer should choose it over a competitor like Substack or Patreon. Before we jump into the interview, I'm going to read you an ad from this week's sponsor. Just kidding. This show has no advertising. In fact, the only way that I monetize this show is through paying subscribers. If those subscribers don't come through, then I can't guarantee that new episodes will continue landing in your podcast app each week, and you won't get all these insights that help you create and monetize your content. It's that simple. If you are willing to support my journalism, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Signing up will get you subscriber-only newsletters that are packed with the kind of insights you've come to expect from this podcast. Okay, on to my interview with John. Hey, John, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you're on to talk about a publishing platform you created, but first I want to talk about your path to launching the platform. You used to work for WordPress. What did you do there?
I was the deputy head of design on the open source team for WordPress for a number of years.
And what does that mean?
So it's a volunteer group of individuals who all contribute to making the open source software. My role was to lead the design and front-end development side of things, basically responsible for making the user interface, the back end of WordPress, the admin experience.
And were you obviously you work on a publishing platform now, were you kind of attracted to, was there something about the idea of working on a publishing platform that is in some ways utilized by tens of millions of people, both on the publishing side, but also the reader side, that kind of appealed to you? Like, what drew you to publishing platforms?
My path in was a little more organic. I was a freelance web designer with lots of clients who were trying to do blogging. It was a lot of big brands, a lot of big companies doing blogging at the time when it was really in its heyday, and they were all trying to figure it out. And I felt like I would probably end up doing a better job for them if I had more knowledge of the inside of WordPress. So I started contributing one day, partially out of just curiosity about open source and how it all works, and partially to try and figure out how I could do a better job of building the blogs and magazines for the clients I was working with at the time, and discovered this whole new world of open source publishing and building software in the cloud, which sounds very silly now, but was all a lot more new and exciting at the time. I guess this was around 2008-9, maybe.
And did you have any strong interest in media, or is it just something you kind of fell into sideways?
The interest in media kind of evolved over time, just seeing how the online journalism space evolved, how social media evolved, how all of those things came together. It became kind of an active interest, and seeing how new media was transforming the web. Again, it all sounds terribly cliched now, but was fascinating to me. And so the fascination with content management systems and publishing and what was happening on the web at the time kind of all culminated in one set of interests that really have formed most of my career, I guess.
Well, there are a lot of publishers on WordPress. I forget what the latest statistic that they tout, but it's some like huge percent of the internet, like in terms of the open internet, is hosted on a WordPress platform. But there seems to be a movement right now to move onto other platforms that are more geared specifically for news organizations. Obviously the Washington Post is working on Arc. Vox has Chorus. Minute Media just raised like $40 million to try to grow its publishing platform and license that out. Why do you think there is this movement towards moving away from something that's like a little bit more open source to something that's very specifically geared towards news organizations?
Yeah, I think it's probably less about moving away from something that's open source and more about moving towards something that is modern and fits in with a current feature set. It's sort of a natural progression of markets over time that you often start out with one general product and end up eventually with lots of very specific products. And what WordPress has become is a very general tool for doing just about anything for anyone. And over time, as the web has gotten bigger and bigger and the population of the internet has grown, we've ended up with lots of new platforms that do more specific things. You now have Shopify for e-commerce, you have Squarespace for the generic website building, you have Ghost for something specific like publishing online, and increasingly many others. So I think it's a natural progression to some extent, but also that the competition is just a lot more fierce than it used to be.
Do you think that WordPress almost suffers, and you kind of hinted at this of being a very general, but it's almost like a too open of a platform? Like, I have a personal website, simonowens.net, it's built on WordPress, but I eventually just stopped. Like, I used to like publish all my content to it, but I eventually stopped publishing on it because I was just afraid of the website breaking down because of some outdated plugin, like basically blowing up or something like that. I didn't feel like, because I didn't have a technical background and skill set and would have to pay a WordPress developer to do everything, I eventually migrated to like a less open platform. It was Medium then, now it's Substack now, where I gave away a lot of my freedom, but it gave me peace of mind. Do you think that a lot of publishers kind of feel like it's almost a little bit too open and too general, and it's not like flexible enough to really adapt to the changing mores of the web?
To some extent, so the problems that you're identifying there definitely resonate. I would argue that it's less an issue of openness and more one of fragility, which is more tricky for open platforms. So those two kind of overlap quite a great deal. The problem that we've always sort of seen working in open source and trying to get mass consumer adoption is exactly the types of things you said. Consumers don't know what to do or don't want to have to deal with it when some plugin breaks or some security issue takes their site offline. Centralized platforms have an inherent advantage in just being able to manage those types of issues more easily, whereas for open platforms, it's much more of a challenge. So the two go hand in hand to some extent, but it's really just about how difficult it is. I do think that issue now for WordPress is more significant with an aging plugin ecosystem, and again, much more intensive competition that has fewer issues. The new platforms like Medium and Substack that you mentioned are just incredible for getting started. You know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but within a couple of clicks, you can have no fuss, no understanding of what PHP or JavaScript is. You're just up and running and publishing. Whereas open platforms, there's always going to be some more advanced technical aspects to it, which requires a larger baseline knowledge. Usually that just means the platforms are better suited to different demographics. I think the open platforms will always allow you to do more, but they inherently have more requirements, and the central platforms will always be easier for beginners or non-technical people even to get started with.
And I'm sure most listeners know what we're talking about, just to explain, and you can elaborate since you know more about this, but because WordPress is open source, anybody can build tools on top of it, and a lot of WordPress blogs, news sites, they utilize these plugins. But correct me if I'm wrong, if the developer isn't updating the plugin as WordPress itself continues to update to new versions, then the plugin becomes basically outdated and in some ways unstable and can crash your website. Or especially, like, I had a friend who ran a really popular political news site, and sometimes he would get some huge rush of traffic and his website would just break because some plugin like just could not take the weight of it. Is that kind of an accurate explanation, layman's explanation of what happens?
Yeah, that's a pretty great explanation. And so what we're trying to do with Ghost is kind of hit the middle of these two ends of the spectrum, where we still have an open platform, but we don't have plugins and we don't use some of the older types of technology that WordPress uses. So what Ghost tries to hit is the spot in between, where it's advanced enough for power users, but simple enough for people to get started with, and still with an open source code base.
So speaking of Ghost, so like, what got you itching to start something new? Like, when did you first get the inklings to that you weren't satisfied with WordPress and wanted to branch off and do your own thing?
Yeah, I had that inkling for quite a while whilst contributing to core WordPress for lots of reasons that kind of added up. And at the time, which was end of 2012, I very much had the thought of, who wants yet another content management system? It wasn't even a good idea back then, let alone now. But the itch wouldn't go away, and I had to scratch it. So I wrote a blog post, and I just kind of summarized my idea. I'd done a couple of mock-ups, and I published that on my personal website and sent a tweet. And I thought that would be the end of it. And that was a firestorm of a week for me. That went to #1 on Hacker News, which is kind of a really popular subreddit type thing for programmers, and got 250,000 views within the space of a week of people saying, yes, no, we want this. We want an alternative that is focused on publishing. And my premise was WordPress has become too general now. It is just a generic website builder, whereas what it started out as was a focused tool for publishers. And that's what I would now like to create in the form of Ghost.
And what were some of the broad strokes of the blog post? Like, what were some of the specific things that you identified that you wanted to fix or make better?
The most significant things were to have a focused experience for the end user. So to have a clean writing interface. Everybody loves Medium's editor, and they're less keen on the sheer amount of clutter inside WordPress that's very difficult to work with on day to day. So a clean experience, speed, security, stability, kind of none of the things that were breaking in WordPress breaking, alongside all of the new fancy exciting things that were happening in the other platforms. And then the big structural change that we proposed was to set everything up as a non-profit organization. So we would never have investors. We would never have some future where you spend 10 years investing all your time building on a platform which then ultimately gets sold to Microsoft, and a few years later a blog post appears about their incredible journey and how they're now shutting down. So we kind of wanted to guarantee a socially responsible business model and sustainable structure, as well as a better product. Premise was as simple as that, with a lot of nuanced details in between.
And how did you capture all this interest? Like, were you creating like an email bot, like a form that people could fill out? Like, it seems like you had kind of like a flash in the pan type of virality. Were you able to capture any of that interest so that you could utilize it once you started building the platform?
Kind of, yeah. It's one of these classic 10 years to overnight success stories, because for my entire career up to that point, I'd been working in the exact same space. So I established a blog and a Twitter profile, and I was reasonably well known from my work in WordPress and speaking at conferences for them around the world. So I had an established audience of people who knew the space and the products and the problems that this was proposing to solve very well. And that kind of seeded the initial amount of people who were going to share it, I guess, alongside Hacker News. And then the flash in the pan was how far it spread beyond that. And I had an email capture page at the bottom of my blog post saying, this idea is not a reality, it's just a concept. But if you'd like to know if it ever turns into something, drop your email here. And so I ended up, after a week, with a lot more people following me on Twitter and about 35,000 email addresses, all of whom had signed up to try and find out if this ever became real.
Wow, I'd love to get 35,000 email addresses overnight for my newsletter. So did you get any pushback from the WordPress development community? Because that's a very tight-knit community, right?
It is, yeah, and I know that community very well, and very mixed. So I largely received lots and lots of support from all of my friends within that community and colleagues within that community who are familiar with my work and for whom a lot of the ideas resonated with. I think, at the very least, open source communities tend to be reasonably supportive of other open source ideas and projects, even when they are proposing competitors. Of course, there's always going to be a few detractors in between who are naysayers along the way, but that's kind of expected. You can't really get away from that.
And so how did you start making the dream a reality? Like, you have these 30,000 email addresses. Like, did you launch a Kickstarter next?
Yes, so having that amount of traction from a blog post was the most validation I'd ever had for an idea that I'd come up with. And I'd definitely come up with more ideas before that. They just definitely weren't good ones. So it was very easy for me to kind of justify to myself to go away and live off my savings for 6 months and kind of plow all of my focus into this new idea, find my co-founder, Hannah Wolf, and for us to build a prototype. And the prototype is what we used to seed a Kickstarter campaign. And the theory we had was it's pretty easy to get people excited on Twitter, relatively speaking, but can we get those same people to open their wallet and say, hey, actually, I want this new product so much that I'm willing to pre-order it when it's in its prototypal stage and barely exists. So we kind of cobbled together a video, a basic user interface and a demo of it all working, and put it on Kickstarter on April 29th, 2019.
So relatively recently.
Sorry,
so then...
Sorry, big mistake there. 2013. I didn't realize.
2013, okay.
Not that recent.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was a little shocked by that. And then, so how did it spread? Like, what? Like, you had these? Was it virtually through those 30,000? You were able to seed it through those 30,000 email, and then they kind of spread. You had your initial contributions, and then they shared it on their social media accounts. Like, how did it kind of move around?
Yeah, so the best thing about collecting all those email addresses from the blog post was it was the really obvious pre-sale list come the time of the Kickstarter. So our initial funding goal was about $30,000, £25,000, and we hit that within 11 hours. And then over the course of a 29-day fundraising campaign, we went on to raise about $300,000 in the Kickstarter, or a very large proportion of which was the early sign-up group. We also had partners, sort of partner level sponsors that came on board really early. Again, thanks to connections and all work I'd done previously in open source, people who already knew me very well. So Envato very kindly sponsored, WooThemes sponsored, which biggest, they'd now been acquired by Automatic. At the time, they were the biggest independent theme shop in the world for WordPress, and a number of others along the way. And it kind of, again, spread virally as people picked up on the idea and saw more evidence that this could be a reality and be something really exciting. Then shortly after the Kickstarter campaign closed, Microsoft came along and also wanted to sponsor for another $50,000 just after the fact. So it was this kind of rush of everything happening very quickly, and there just being tons of interest in what we were doing.
And what did people get if they contributed?
So there were different tiers. The sort of base level tier was just, hey, you're contributing. We're going to send you all the news about Ghost and send you a copy when it's done. Obviously, it's free, but that was the lowest level. And then we had developer tiers that went up in how much sort of early access you would get. So the higher the level of tier, then the more early access development you would get to sort of private community where the pre-alpha was being built, so you could test it beforehand. I'm trying to remember all the other perks now. We had a launch party. One of the tiers got you access to that, and sponsors got their logo on all our initial launch materials and a banner at the launch party, that type of thing. We were really strict about having only digital rewards, no physical rewards, no t-shirts, no things like that. A lot of Kickstarter campaigns fall into a trap of doing t-shirt rewards, and what they discover quite quickly is that they're going to spend the next year doing fulfillment of printing and delivering t-shirts, which can really distract from the original idea of the project. So that's one thing we really got right, was to make all the rewards centered around delivering the actual products and not delivering a whole set of extra things.
Yeah, it's interesting because you think of a publishing platform as it's not something that you sign up for spontaneously. It's kind of like a point of sale type of thing. So like if you launch in like April or whatever the month was, it's not like there were a ton of people who needed a publishing platform in April. You get what I'm sort of saying? It's not like candy where you can buy it anytime. It's like something that you only shop for like once every 10 years, if that. So it's interesting that people were contributing because they could get access to a product. Like, were these people who were looking to switch to a new platform or looking to start publishing? I just kind of wonder what that demographic was.
Definitely your kind of tech early adopter market. There's a new product and I will try it. I don't think it extended too much beyond that, other than a lot of people believed in the idea and the philosophy that we were positioning, which is that we wanted an open platform focused on journalism, and all of the newer publishing platforms popping up then and now were not open source, and so it felt like the open source alternatives were beginning to get stuck in an old era that was dying, whereas all the new platforms that were popping up were kind of moving away from that initial philosophy of the web that made it so open and so available and so equal for everyone. So that wrapped up in a nonprofit organization that was positioning itself to be around for a long time to come. Definitely resonated with some people who really believed in the message, and a whole large group of other people who just wanted to see a new platform and try it out, because that's what we do.
So, how did you build the platform? Like, were you able to take that like $300,000 and hire developers? Like, what really went into like building kind of like a robust, what turned out to be Ghost?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to having a incredible co-founder called Hannah Wolf, who's in many ways the brains of the operation. So I'm a front-end developer and designer. She's an extremely good back-end developer, and between us, we put together the bulk of the first version ourselves with incredible help from about 10 open source contributors who we invited to come and participate in basically the first version build, which took about 6 months from the end of the Kickstarter campaign. And that was it. It was a very minimal first version of the product. It didn't do a lot of things. You could write a post and you could publish it. That was about as much as you could do. There was almost no features in it, but it was a starting point that got things going. And yeah, building anything from scratch is difficult as a platform. At the time, so we built on Node.js, which is a JavaScript framework, which is very new at the time. So the advantage is it's very fast. You can do a lot more with it compared to WordPress. It's much more modern technology. But even in 2013, it was brand new, which meant there were a lot of people hadn't done common things before. Like there was no way to easily do RSS feeds using this new programming language, something which is completely easy and totally well understood in older programming languages like PHP. So we had some kind of roadblocks to getting going, and some difficulties figuring out how to make this new technology work for us. But we got there.
And who were some of your earliest, most high profile users?
Let's see. We had Leo Borta from Zen Habits in the Kickstarter. We had Tucker Max of They Only Serve Beer in Hell. Almost all of WordPress's sort of core development team who I'd worked with over the years. Such a long time ago now. Various other people. I could find you a list. Maybe we could add them to the show notes if it's of interest.
But like, were there like actual like publishers, like news publishers or media publishers that were launching on it? Or was this more kind of, you mentioned that there wasn't a ton of functionality, and we're going to talk about what publishers today can do on it. But was this just made like individual users who might have otherwise just gone to WordPress.com before? Or like, what was kind of like the level, like in terms of the level of the user who was signing up for Ghost early on?
Yeah, so our early adopter group was definitely broadly individuals, often very technical individuals, either programmers or web developers, with some individuals who had a strict interest in the blogging and publishing space. I'm trying to remember now. We had quite a few university professors for journalism courses. We're probably the closest to the demographic you're describing, but definitely not local newspapers or big media agencies, because we were just nowhere near being ready for that sort of thing yet. Even the idea we were proposing was still far too light for that type of usage.
So someone wanted to have like a personal website. They might have in the past used a Squarespace or a WordPress, but instead they were signing up for for Ghost.
Yeah, but specifically a blog. And our earliest tagline was just a blogging platform, just as in focus rather than as in a lack of things. But it was very much just a blogging platform. If you want a blog, come to Ghost. If you want a website, go to WordPress or Squarespace. Mm-hmm. That was the early pitch.
In some ways, I mean, we could debate this, but like 2013, 2014, like that was kind of the tail end of what we consider the traditional blogosphere. So you had kind of a lot of users going in two different directions. One, either social media, just like finding what they needed through like Twitter or Facebook. And then on the other end, kind of more professionalized news sites, multi-author, a lot of times actually generating some kind of income or something like that. Was this kind of like a weird time to be launching kind of like a basic blogging platform?
It was and it wasn't. Yeah, you're absolutely right that it was the kind of end of the blogging renaissance and social media was taking over. But even in 2013 was when we was having some sort of blogging renaissance of new things popping up that people were rediscovering their interest and their passion about. It was Medium was launched almost around the exact same time. We had Subtle, if you remember that one, that launched I think 6 months previously. There was, I think, Tiny Letter was around the same time, which, while not blogging, attracted a very similar audience. And there was a couple more of just sort of new blogging platforms that popped up that really said, hey, there's still a lot of people interested in writing on the internet in a way that works for them. And so there was just a bunch of new products that all came along at the same time. And it was surprising, even to me, how much interest there was, because like you, I felt like maybe the industry had moved on, and it still hasn't.
But you gradually added more robust features so that now technically a publisher that is already in existence or aspiring to launch could create their site on Ghost, and there's enough functionality now to where they could monetize. Can you talk a little bit about that? So, like, you think about the modern publisher and the different ways they might that they monetize. They might have some kind of subscription paywall or membership platform, or they might have e-commerce or merchandise or events. They obviously need a robust email marketing platform. Like, what would be your kind of pitch of like a publisher? Let's say a publisher that has an old, outdated CMS and they're kicking the tires of different options. What would be your pitch to them that they should use Ghost?
Yeah, so the way our product roadmap kind of evolved over the years is we started out in this space of saying, hey, it's just a blogging platform. And that attracted all of our initial user base. And then what we learned over time, listening to user feedback and evolving the platform and building new things, was that publishing, just the act of publishing on the web, writing something and having it be distributed on the web, was largely a solved problem. There were so many platforms that could do that. Now it was no longer kind of a new and exciting thing that it was in the way of when, say, WordPress came along, or LiveJournal, all those early things when writing something on the internet and distributing it was new. We've moved on from that, definitely. So the question we asked ourselves was, what are the real problems? What are the most significant new problems being faced by the users that we care about the most, the demographic we care about the most, which in our case is independent writers, publishers, people, podcasters forms the same group, people creating content and trying to have it be distributed, and that being their professional thing that they do on the internet. What's the actual issue? And it is not really that revolutionary to point out that the biggest issue faced by that group of people is a business model, is a lack of business model, because for the last decade or two, advertising revenue on the internet has been in decline as Google and Facebook have systematically eaten it all from newspaper companies. And we've had the worst period in history. Both, the graphs usually always point to the US newspaper industry, but it's really worldwide in terms of how much revenue newsrooms have available to even invest in journalism, and how much publishers are able to make from advertising per click or per view. Those are the real problems, and those are the things that when we talk to people, we heard them talk about struggling with, is simply, how am I going to make this job continue to be a job, because it feels like it's disappearing. And around the same time, we had built up a hosting business for our CMS, which was based on subscription revenue, recurring revenue each month. And we'd started to see new publishers adopt that model for delivering content. So we had, early people like Ben Thompson of Stratechery. The information wasn't around yet. I think the Dutch version of The Correspondent was just starting to make some noise. And that seemed like a really interesting future for where online publishing could go. And it seemed like it made sense and was starting to have traction. So quite early, around 2015, we were already starting to think about maybe the future of what a modern publishing platform should be a business platform which allows you not only to create and distribute content, but also something that allows you to build an audience and directly engage with it, and then deliver content via subscriptions, paid subscriptions, to be able to have a sustainable recurring business model that allows you to keep operating independently. So that's where we've ended up at today. And today what Ghost is, compared to other platforms, is a full publishing platform with a full suite of subscription features. So you can run a paid newsletter, you can run a paid site. And the differentiator really, compared to things like Substack, is if you just want to do a newsletter, it's quite easy to get going with Substack. But if you want to build out something larger, more significant, like The Information, like Stratechery, or like The Correspondent, that's what Ghost can do. So if you want to build a full paid members-based publication with all of the features needed to do that, that's the position that Ghost is in today, and that's definitely our pitch to the modern publisher.
What does that mean, though, that it's more robust than a Substack? Like, what can I give me an example of something I could do that with your site that I couldn't do with Substack?
Sure. So if you sign up to Substack, you can send a newsletter, and that's all you can do. You can change the text in the newsletter. That's it. If you need a custom website, you want to have different navigation, you want to change the design, you want to have different opt-in forms, you want to have integrations with third-party systems. If you want to do anything custom at all, you cannot customize platforms such as Medium or Substack beyond changing some colors. What you can do with any open platform, of which Ghost is the example in this case, is completely customize them to build out custom websites, custom publications, customize everything based on your goals and what you want to build with it.
So it's like a Substack, but like way more. It's like Substack crossed with WordPress, and so to speak, in the sense of like it's you can really kind of, because that is a frustration of mine. Like I recently launched a paid version of my Substack, and I was kind of a little annoyed that I could not like change various landing pages. Like I literally can't go and actually change the wording when subscribers hit the like where they can like actually pay to subscribe. I can't even change the wording that describes what they're going to get if they become paying subscribers. So like you're saying, like if you really want to have a more nuanced subscription offering, your Ghost basically provides a little bit more customization.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so what we often say to people is Substack is a very easy way, and often the best way to get started if you don't know yet if you're going to have a big audience, you don't know yet how seriously you're going to take this. And what we are experiencing right now is a lot of the biggest Substack publishers who are having the same issues that you've had and are now looking to kind of upgrade to a more serious platform where they do have full control, and they have now the revenue and the audience to justify the investment in that, are starting to move over to Ghost. So a couple of the biggest Substack publishers are in the process of moving to Ghost right now for that exact reason. That's
interesting. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because like one thing I've seen a lot, I get pitches from a lot of these platforms, and I always kind of look like who's actually using it. Patreon can like point to some like really huge YouTubers and podcasters and even a few writers, but also some big musicians that are on its platform and say, hey, look, here are some people making like real money on our platform. Substack can do the same thing. It has a few different publishers that have several thousands paying subscribers, and then a lot more that have subscribers in the hundreds. Can you lay claim to any of that? Like, are there like some homegrown creators that are using your platform that are making a real living?
Yes, so we've had a few people migrate over. So just for context, we launched our members and subscriptions functionality about 3 months ago. So, and it's very much, it's still technically a beta. It works very well, but we're still in the very early stages of having people use this new functionality. So to some extent, we haven't had that long to get those types of people on the platform just yet. But no, we have the listener is probably one of our most prominent ones that's migrated over from Substack, which is run by Carolyn Crampton and highlights 3 of the best podcasts every single day, which is I think I'm okay saying in the hundreds of paying subscribers. And actually the very first site to fittingly to launch with our new members and subscriptions functionality is I relaunched a personal blog, which is a paid publication and newsletter about remote work, open source platforms, kind of everything that that I like to do, and that's already in the hundreds of paying subscribers too. But our kind of larger list of customers that we point to are the historical ones who have been using the publishing platform without necessarily using the paid subscriptions that we've been doing for 7 years. So we've got people like Stanford Review, Harvard International Review, in the kind of more journalism space, and then we've got independent publications run by a lot of big brands, including OpenAI, DuckDuckGo, Tinder, Mozilla, all kinds of people across the spectrum of corporate companies running brand publications to more independent publications doing their own thing.
So companies that don't need to directly monetize their content, but it's part of their larger brand content marketing offerings.
Yes, and the thing they have in common is they're all trying to publish content. They're all trying to build an audience that they engage with directly. The difference is where you make the money. Do you make the money directly off the content that you're selling access to, or are you making the money off promoting a secondary product, a SaaS product, for example, that you sell access to? But the broad goals are very comparable.
And platforms like Substack and Patreon are famously they have like they basically take a percentage of the amount you make. So the Substack I think takes like 10%. So if I'm making $10,000, so it's free to use the platform like when I'm just sending to my non-paying subscribers. But once I kick in the paying part, they take like 10%. So if I'm ever making $10,000 a month, they would take $1,000 of that. Obviously you just launched your subscription offering, so that's not how you've been monetizing. How does the pricing work for you guys? Yeah,
so we have 0% fees forever, which becomes more and more relevant kind of as you point out over time, because when you're at $10,000 spending $1,000, it doesn't seem that crazy, but when you get to $1 million and you're spending $100,000, and the product is still doing the same thing, it starts to feel a little different. So, being a open source, decentralized products, you have to monetize in different ways to some extent. You can't necessarily piggyback off the fees of what people are doing when the technology is running on servers that you don't control. That's one of the great beauties of decentralized software. So we have just a flat hosting fee that you could pay to us or to someone else to host the software. But after that, you connect Ghost, our software, directly to your Stripe account, and we are in no way involved in the transaction at any stage. So there's no fees from us at any point.
So they pay like a flat fee like they would with like a Squarespace or something like that, where this is how much it costs to host a month?
So with something like Substack or Memberful, you would pay your credit card processing fee, which is usually about 3% plus the additional transaction processing fee. With us and with kind of other open platforms, you would pay a hosting fee, which is usually a flat fee starting around $29 a month, and then no additional percentage. So the cost doesn't go up depending on how much revenue you have. And the other benefit is if we ever go out of business, Ghost, the company, ceases to exist, the software just keeps working. Nothing breaks, nothing goes away. You still get to use it, you still get to keep it, you still have unlimited rights to the IP, and it's still your Stripe account, so you still keep taking revenue. If any of these centralized, funded startups disappear because they aren't able to find a scalable, repeatable business model over time, unfortunately, they tend to take down all of the people who have built on top of them. And while that used to be a kind of a doomsday prophecy that was not widely believed, I think in the last year people have woken up slightly to the fact that this is a reality of technology businesses which fail to make money and what ultimately ends up happening to them.
And publishers obviously use other monetization models other than subscriptions. If I'm a large publisher, like let's say I'm a mid-sized daily or something like that, and I'm kicking the tires of CMSs, I wouldn't want to go with Ghost, would I? Because do you guys play well with ad tech and other kinds of like merchandise, different stuff like that, or is that functionality you want to add in the future, or where is that on the product roadmap, if at all?
So to some extent, it's already there, and to some extent, it's definitely not. I'll try and kind of qualify that. Because Ghost is open source, it can be integrated with absolutely anything. So there are no inherent limitations. So if you have particular ad tech, which involves needing to run some JavaScript on every page of your site, which is what 99% of all ad tech is, yeah, that completely works and is very easy to set up, and there's no reason you shouldn't do it. We don't inherently optimize for those use cases, and we don't have any roadmap that is working towards doing more with those use cases, because fundamentally, I don't believe in the future of the ad tech space. I don't think it's going anywhere that is worth investing in. So it's not where our core focus is. We think subscriptions and memberships and building direct audiences and relationships between publishers and direct audiences is definitely the future, and that's where we're kind of focusing all of our product interest around. But due to the nature of an open source platform, you really can do whatever you want with it, and that would still work for any publisher that still has basic developer resources, very basic developer resources, to be able to make the connection between different pieces of technology.
Looking 5 to 10 years out, who's your dream customer base? Like, are you hoping that there's like 1,000 Ben Thompsons using your platform, or are you thinking I would love the next Gawker, the next Talking Points Memo, or whatever mid-sized publisher to be choosing Ghost as its go-to platform?
1,000 Ben Thompsons, both philosophically and fiscally or economically, would be a dream come true. Ben has done pretty incredibly for a one-man outfit, and is bigger in almost any way you could measure than a lot of much larger publishing houses. So yeah, Ben's a great example of where I hope we end up with more of in the next 5 years. I think Substack is also a great sign toward there being interest in having more individual publishers sort of reach that scale and do similar things. Beyond that, I think there's slightly larger operations that follow the same model. Again, I mentioned before, like The Information, like The Correspondent, who are starting to do the same thing in the context of there's multiple writers and we're covering a larger beat. And there's a direct audience who's interested in that. And it's just the same thing at a slightly larger scale. And then further out than that, I think there's a much broader content space, which we're interested in. Patreon speaks much more to the artists, and I guess that's where they really targeted initially was, how are these musicians going to make money, and how are painters going to make money, and indie game developers. And Patreon's kind of become the hammer with which to beat all nails that look like businesses that might be able to use a subscription model. And so you have a lot of interesting people who fall into that space who might actually be podcasters, or they might be YouTubers. And ostensibly, they're all publishers creating content for usually a highly engaged audience. And they're trying to have a recurring, sustainable business model that fits with what they're doing. And so having an independent alternative to Patreon that could be used by anyone who's trying to build an audience with content is kind of the space we're looking to. And I guess people are starting to sort of refer to this as subscription commerce in a way that might be comparable to e-commerce. And in that sense, we're sort of trying to be the Shopify of that space as it grows. Okay,
John. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find more of your work online?
So if you're interested in Ghost and you'd like to see more, head to ghost.org, spelled the normal way. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at John O'Nolan.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.